Good afternoon. We're going to, as you said, be talking about the behavior code. And uh, this was a book that was written a while back, 2012, but it was written because we lose 25% of our teachers in the first 5 years. So the role that you play as a social worker supporting teachers and students is huge. And I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a associate professor at Harvard Medical School and have worked for 25 years in public schools and worked at a school-based health center at uh, Cambridge Ringe and Latin High School, and also consulted to schools. And my specialty is doing what I choose to call safety assessments. Some people call threat assessments. And yeah, and I worked in when I first started preschool through third grade in Harlem and uh, wrote the behavior code and a memoir. And this is just to send from you to your house, from my house, to say hello. And and this is also just to acknowledge, which we all know, which is that it's been a roller coaster. And whether it's the pandemic or the fire hose of announcements that happen every day, or it's the ice that's happening. My heart goes out to anybody in Illinois, especially right now. And I am committed during this time to try to feed you so you feel ready to go back and be with your students and be with your staff. And what I would ask you to do is to choose a student that you might have seen today, or that, you know, how sometimes you're driving home and you find yourself flipping back and thinking about a student and wondering what to do. I want to share two students now, and but pick a student. And at the end of this session, I'm also going to ask one thing you might take home to support a student that might have come from today's lecture. So this is Aaron, high school student. He's asleep on the desk. The teacher comes up. He's snoozing through history, and she taps him on the shoulder. He is startled. He wakes up, and but he looks aggressive. And she says, "You know, you're sleeping during class." He starts to bolt out of class, and then the teacher puts up her arm, and he is in a fight or flight, goes to leave, and now he has an assault and battery in because of his response. Another student is a first grader, Liz, and she's asked by the teacher to write a short composition about um, her weekend. And unbeknownst to the teacher, most of the weekend was spent with a huge fight between her two parents, and she crumples up the paper and goes underneath the desk. So what I first want to spend some time talking about, and it may be, you know, there's some very seasoned people here. I heard there's both um, um, a social worker who 25 years in the Detroit system and someone else for 20 years. And some of you may be new. What I want you to take away from when I'm talking about trauma, some of this might be information that's familiar to you, but how do I, over the last 30 years, try to make this digestible for teachers and for parents and for and uh, and here's one of the first things that I talk about is that when you have lived with sharks, you learn not to bleed. If you swim with sharks, you learn not to bleed. And traumatized kids need acceptance and safety in the classroom. And I like to say, you need to know how much you care before they care how much you know. And sometimes traumatized kids present as spitting, biting, growling, cursing, masturbating, screaming. And that that uh, kids who have failed in relationships, sometimes what they do is they provoke and control. And they can be masters in making school adults feel angry or inadequate. One of my pet peeves, but often happens, is a teacher will say, "This kid is manipulative." And how we work to support teachers is so important. Um, and the idea that we have to earn students' trust and to make students believe that human contact is safe. And Many times what can happen is instead people can pull back. So I often am asked when I give these kind of presentations about how to talk about this in an individual ed plan. What's the impact on trauma and learning? And I like Dan Hughes, who wrote a book, Settling to Learn. He talks about in a way that I think can be helpful. And he talks about a hesitation to trust others, looking at reading hostile motives for people's actions, and having a difficulty regulating and integrating strong emotions, and difficulty making sense of the hard times of the past, and a pervasive sense of shame. And what uh, we might include in sort of individual ed language is to assess the capacity for regulation, and rather than talking about managing behavior, increasing the emotional vocabulary. So that's something that can be helpful, and help with the awareness of their internal experience. I find this slide about child maltreatment, which is the year, how many children are referred to the Department of Children's Services uh, throughout the United States, really interesting. Because if you think about it, 686,000 children, and we all know, and sometimes there are people in the audience who might have been former DCSF workers, Department of Children, how hard it is to actually get someone ruled in for this. But what I find interesting is of the 686,000 children, 78% have had neglect. And that, what I think the way that shows up is that when students who have had neglect, when they feel a need, they can often feel ashamed. And so that there's if you think about um, when a child learns how to read, they have to be willing to make mistakes and to be corrected. And so this resistance to being able to ask for help is one of the, I think, hard things that teachers struggle with at times. And I just wanted to I hope I meant, and I said I was an associate professor, but I didn't say I'm a child psychiatrist, medical doc. And I just want to take a few moments to share the brain and talk about it. So what we are looking at here is a cross section of the brain, and the middle part is where the ventricles are, the black part, and then there's the deep part of the brain. And in the deep part of the brain, there's the amygdala, and that's the smoke detector of your brain. It's the part that can process danger. And when and what's I think is really interesting to me is the amygdala, it comes when you're first born. It's fully developed. And that's why the first, if any of you have new babies, not to make you anxious, but the first 4 months are so important because you're laying down the groundwork of reciprocity and predictability. And then there's the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the other part of the brain, which is sort of the lizard part of the brain. And that is the fear response, but it's more about the memory, and it organizes explicit memory and and the modulation of emotion, and that's a late bloomer. It happens, and that's why you have kids who have early childhood amnesia. So um, that's really important because when we have uh, teachers who may say, "Why did you do this?" it doesn't it doesn't compute for a kid because they can't always articulate why they did it. They can't say, well, I'm hypervigilant because I got the shit kicked, sorry for the French. I got kicked around when I was, nonverbal. And so that, I just wanted to bring that up as a reminder. And then sometimes I actually will encourage people to have this in their uh, if you're a clinician, to have it in your room when you're talking with parents. I think it's a really important, because what it's talking about is, when do you have conversations with kids? And sometimes what happens is when a student has an outburst, that's when teachers are asking kids about what's going on and why they're doing it. And when you're in the hyperarousal state, that's the time when you actually want to just be able to join around the emotion. And when you're in the hypoarousal, that's when somebody, like when we were talking about with Aaron, who was asleep, that's when there's a complete shutdown. And many times, school adults and parents don't recognize that hypoarousal can be a uh, um, traumatic response. And I think Dan Siegel talks about you have to name it to tame it. And this idea of being able to recognize what state is the student in and when do you want to have the discussion is really important. The next thing I just want to say is joy is the opposite of trauma. And right now, there is a lot of trauma that's happening for both the school adults and for students. And if we can um, bring in a playfulness and look for moments when we can bring joy within our schools, it's so important not to lose that. And in that vein, I want to just share, so often we talk about adverse childhood events. And I really like, though, uh, these questions that are being asked that are um, seem really important to me, which is about benevolent childhood experiences and how intentional we want to be about fortifying kids and ask, thinking with, I wish we could do inventory with your caseload. How many of them have at least one caregiver with whom they feel safe? Do they have one good friend? And do they like school? Do they have one teacher who cares about them? And you can look at the more of the questions, but I think it's a nice questionnaire. So I wanted to take some moments to think about what is the impact of on learning with trauma. And I think it comes out in three, I like to categorize it into three different places: memory and writing, classroom behavior, and relationships. And I'll be moving through this. So I think in terms of looking at solutions, there is movement. There's a paradigm shift. I think we have moved from automatic suspensions and zero tolerance, most in many schools. But I would ask you to look at what your if your student has a behavior chart, and many students who are in self-contained classrooms have behavior charts. And sometimes what you find is the emphasis is on the behavior that you want to see, following adult directions, using school language, using a safe body, and not on the skill that needs to be done. And the reason why that's so important to add in the skills is when I was talking about the hyperarousal or how the amygdala can hijack the cortex. If you have an emphasis on the behavior, if you ask a kid to speak Chinese and they don't have the skill to do it, it doesn't matter how many rewards you're going to give to them. So it goes back to, if any of you are familiar with Ross Greene's book, The Explosive Child, Kids Do Well When They Can. And we want to just help them out with building the skills. And I would just encourage you to see if you have a self-contained classroom to check and make sure that it's not the emphasis on the behavior, but more on the skill. So how do we build safe havens? I think the research clearly shows having at least one secure attachment, and you may be the secure attachment for your students. And I think the other aspect that students need to learn is being able to face and learn from mistakes, which is a huge growth if what kids have learned is if I make a mistake, I might get hit or I might be shamed. And I just had a patient today where I was working with the family about how do you manage conflict and repair relationships. And um, I really wish we would rename detention and suspensions. There's no data supporting that detentions and suspensions work, and which is really remarkable to me because so many times education works on data-driven information. But I wish we could come up with something that incorporated safe havens. So when I wrote, what I'm going to be talking about first is some SOS tips. When I wrote the behavior code, I pulled a couple of them that might be useful when you're working with teachers and parents. And then I'm going to be going over the FAIR plan. We know in this world that uh, educators love acronyms. I think we live in the world of acronyms. And the reason we chose FAIR is because many times when kids are emotionally dysregulated, teachers will feel like it's not fair that this child's taking so much of our time in a classroom. But how do we front load? So I'm going to just give you a case, an example that I had, and then extrapolate some of the SOS tips that might be useful. I was running a group with 6 kids and 6 teenagers at a residential facility the day before Thanksgiving. And Ashley stood up, clenched her fists, raised her shoulders, and grabbed a light bulb. Don't ask me why a light bulb was in our classroom where she could have grabbed it, but she had it. And I'm not trained in restraints. I know that many educators, that's uh, a requirement. But I made an interpretation as a way of de-escalating. And I said, it looks like you feel like your world is falling apart and nobody's doing anything to help. And she dropped the light bulb. Part of the de-escalation was taking a step back for myself. Any of you who have toddlers, I just was taking care of my grandson and he had a rip-roaring temper tantrum. I hope my daughter never watches this. Uh, and it's amazing when you're around someone who's escalated, how your heart starts to beat and how, and just taking a moment to bring the the temperature down to be as calm as possible within your own body. Uh, so the tip one was that misbehavior is a symptom. That's a cultural concept. For many of you who may be working in diverse school settings, that's something that may seem quote unquote obvious, but it really isn't. When a we know as clinicians that when a student is struggling and acting out, they're often defending against vulnerability and painful emotions. And we end up being, that's why I called it the behavior code, we end up being curious about what is being tried to be communicated. But uh, that's not always so obvious. When I was I went to Poland to do a book tour on the behavior code, and that was something where that was new information for teachers when I was talking with them. And you may have parents that really haven't thought about that, and so just a good reminder of that. The other thing is that anxiety is a hidden disability, and do you know that when you are anxious, your IQ drops by 30 points? And I think when we have people who are doing FBAs and I'll talk about some of the behaviors we think about, when you have when you're really stuck on a kid who seems unpredictable and that they acted in a way that came out of the blue, my default is that it's probably underlying anxiety. And we use the example, if you take a Coke bottle, you can't tell if someone shook up the Coke bottle. If you said, choose this one or choose this one, and I shaken up this one, you'd be like looking at the Coke bottle and not knowing it. So, and I uh, also going back to just that, so much of what kids read is nonverbal. I had a counselor who would talk to me about how he would just sort of just when there was a disciplinary hearing, he would just make his body be so casual as a way to sort of foster more problem solving the um, for the student. And that goes to the next part about which is behaviors communication. And um, and we talked about that. I like the idea the only behavior we can control is our own. And um, there's a Yiddish saying, you can't control the wind, but you can control the sail. And as we were talking about before, kids who have failed in relationships can provoke and then control. And they're masters at making us angry. And if we can begin to be reflective about our own behavior. And I had a wonderful story that a director of a juvenile detention center told me. And he was he had a student who was in an industrial area dealing drugs outside of the school. And he told me that part of his job was to frisk, and he didn't find anything. And he thought that probably he'd hit it before coming in. And this kid had really escalated. And the director of the juvenile detention center was doing some reflection on what happened. And what he realized was that he had done the frisking in front of others. And so he called him in and gave the student a Coke. And the student looked really confused. Why is he doing that? And he looked surprised. And he said, I'm sorry, I've made a mistake and of frisking you in front of others. And he talked about, part of our job is humility and to own our mistakes. And um, he said, he still, of course, this student still had tough times, but particularly with authority, but that fortified his connection about him being able to own, have a rupture in the relationship and then repair and own his own mistakes. Uh, Another piece that I think is really important to communicate is that behavior can be changed. Um, you all might know about Seligman, who talks about learned optimism and the idea that when you're depressed, it's because things seem permanent and pervasive. And when I was talking with a group of parents about this concept, a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, she had adopted two Russian orphans, and she realized that she had lost hope, and that what we talked about is how important it is to keep the risk small and to look for small changes, and that healing takes time. And it's really important to remember that it takes about 100 repetitions to make a change. And so also taking the changing the timeline of what our expectation is. And it's really crazy when we think about how we structure schools, because I always tell teachers and parents it usually takes to build a secure attachment, it takes 18 months. And yet our school is built up where we have 9 months and then we shift it. So I offer that to you also because hopefully you may provide continuity to your students in ways that can really make a difference. This is probably uh, this is my cheat sheet for today, which is just an overview of what I think are missing skills that I commonly see. And uh, the first one, I think there's a lot of emphasis in schools around self-regulation. And what we really want to be thinking about is co-regulation, especially, and again, some of you said you're kindergarten through fifth or preschool. And these little ones, they need, that's what's going to help them from not going 0 to 100. And helping students identify what would be helpful in the moment that they can begin to identify is really important. And recognizing thinking traps, I like the idea of thinking traps versus, the CBT language of, but I think that's something that teachers can learn really quickly about recognizing with them all or, labeling, name it to tame it, the way I said, where they can talk about all or nothing thinking again and again, must, should, never, end of the world, thinking on the downside. I think those are quick, uh, quick language we can offer to both parents and teachers and students. And I think around the executive functioning, for those of you who don't know Sarah Ward, she's the czar on executive functioning. And some of the things that she has really helped me think about is how important it is for kids to have self-directed talk. So, for instance, and I'm a recovering ADD person, and what she talks about is like going from the first floor to the third floor, or going from the cubby hole to your desk. Many times kids are going to forget what they need to do. And being able to start having a narration where they may quietly say it to themselves can really help with mental imaging and being able to to orient themselves. And I also love what she talks about, how often being able to show the finished product is really helpful for those kids that struggle with executive functioning. And she also has an acronym called STOP, which is helping kids learn about space, time, object, and people. And I just, again, I teach the HMS the Harvard Medical School Mental Health Conference. I've done it for 15 years, and I'm always trying to gather tips and people that might be helpful. And she's someone I would definitely say check her out, and has helped me think about the missing skill in school. And I think another place that kids get really stuck in is flexible thinking. And I had just want to share with you, I was doing the safety assessment on a child who was really dysregulated. And I was telling him, there's a way that you can calm yourself down when you are feeling overwhelmed. And I was talking to him about progressive muscle relaxation and how he could tighten his shoulders or squeeze his hands like a lemon, and he basically said, if I needed to change my mood, I changed the channel, because I was trying to tell him it's this kind of helps you change the channel. He said I'd have one hand on the remote control and the other hand on the power off. So I don't know how many of you have had this where you think, 101 things to do with your student, and they're like not doing it, not having it. And the next day, he gets sent to the principal's office. And the principal calls and says, I don't know what he's doing, but he's squeezing his hands and holding shrugging his shoulders. And I think it's just a reminder to us that sometimes there's a lag time for skills landing.
Nancy, can I pause and ask a
Yes.
question?
Yeah.
Could you give us an example of what co-regulation might look like in a school?
Oh,
Because
I love that. Thank you,
I
Kate.
I very much agree with you. I see so many social work IEP goals that are focused on self-regulation. So I think it would be very helpful to have just an image of what we could maybe do to work on that
You
co-regulation.
know what I'm going to do? I am going to just skip ahead and pick out my favorite slide that would show that, and that educators have found helpful. Hold
Thank
on. I just have to remember where I am right now. I'm on slide 30. I'm going to go to 68. Okay. Dan Hughes. Like I mentioned to him before, he has a model called PACE. And educators and parents get this model. So I'm going to share it with you now instead of having to wait to slide 68. So the PACE model, what he talks about, the P is for being playful and pausing. So the pause is about how the school adult gets themselves their own self-regulation. And the playful is you can diffuse a lot. It's a very tricky thing, playful, because if you use shame in your humor, then that doesn't work. But if you can be playful, that can sometimes shift what seems like an incredibly serious moment. And it's a co-regulation. It's letting them borrow from the idea that they think it's absolute tragedy that little Johnny stole, you know, I failed the test and therefore I ripped up the test. And, like being, I'm trying to think of a moment I did that. Like, one time I went in and I was doing a safety assessment, and the whole classroom had been evacuated because this little girl was throwing a temper tantrum. And we know, like, even a second grader, when they're throwing a temper tantrum, and I came in and I hadn't met her before, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at these chairs. They are plastic chairs. Can you believe that they have plastic chairs in the school? I mean, we need cement chairs. If you're going to throw them around, we should, it was just a way of sort of saying, your affect isn't going to overwhelm me. I can, and then the A is about accepting, again, providing co-regulation, where many times, especially kids who have been traumatized, they may never have had someone name it to tame it. So if you as a school adult come in and this kid is like, I can't believe it, I hate this school. And this is one time a principal told me that this was the one thing she took away from me is so we had done a whole role playing of a dysregulated kid. And then I modeled like, how do you accept that emotion? Like you now, Dan Hughes would say, take it by half. Don't, but sometimes what happens, even as social workers and teachers and psychiatrists, we talk so calm. Oh, you're feeling upset. But if you accept the emotion and you kind of hold it, like you are so frustrated. And teachers get tripped on that because say a kid has just belted a kid, right? Or done something outrageous. Um, you're supposed to accept the emotion, but you have to join to redirect. So accepting the emotion allows the kid to they know they're not supposed to be hitting kids. It's not like you're not accepting the behavior. You're saying the emotion you had. And then the C is for being curious and the E is for being empathic. So it's that's what I would say in terms of co-regulation and trying to uh, work with teachers to help them uh, them do that. And there's a guy named Robert Pianta who's written a book called Enhancing Relationships Between Teachers and Students. And I wish we could redesign how we have clinicians in schools because what his work is about is how do we support the teachers in the relationship with the students so that we're actually helping the teachers build capacity to stay engaged with the students. And that's why I like this one.
I have one more question for you, if now might be a good time. Um, there was a question in the chat about suspensions and detentions. Does that increase behavior that we don't want to see?
I love that question. Thank you. So there is a study that showed it depends. If you have a kid who's used to being the special kid and the kid that follows the rules and you give them, it's by a man who studied this was a psychologist, Mark Atkins. And if you and looked at a group of fourth graders, and he says, okay, one cohort of groups, you give them a suspension, and they never do anything bad again. They're like, oh, I'm so horrified that I got. Not, I mean, that's not a kid language, but that's sort of how they feel. So that cohort, and then there's a cohort that ends up, you give them a suspension, it kind of increases, but then it levels off. But the kids who are hostile and aggressive, you give them suspensions and it keeps going up. It doesn't plateau. So that's really important because what you're inadvertently doing is you're reinforcing the behavior because these hostile, aggressive kids in school, they may be getting a lot of negative feedback. And so it becomes a cycle of school avoidance that if I act up, then I get out of school and I get to be at home, maybe unsupervised, getting to play, be on Game Boy or whatever else people like to do at home. And so that's where I would say if we could bring a curiosity to it. And it's kind of like when you talk about spanking kids. I mean, it doesn't work. That's why you don't do it. That's uh, it just um, like I talk about coercive patterns of aggression. And, when you see a kid escalate to the point where then they get what they want, like, we don't want to be doing things that inadvertently reinforce the behavior. Does that help? Okay. So this is one of my, Karen Pryor was this psychologist who used to be an animal trainer, and she wrote this book called Don't Shoot the Dog. And I think this is something, again, where school personnel can sometimes get frustrated because you come up with this learning, this, plan that you hope's going to work, and then um, you 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 see a dip. And I think, again, we know it, but it's really important to tell the teachers and to parents about the extinction burst, and that um, when a as someone may be learning something, there's a steep decline, and not and that can be really hard if you have a parent that or a teacher that's been beaten down by a child's behavior, and then they think that they're making progress, and then the child does something that makes them catastrophize and think it's never going to be different. And again, I was just working with a family where, this teenager has been making incremental progress for 6 weeks, but just made a dive. And they were so worried that this may spiral down into the kind of situation that had been so entrenched. And I used this framework about a learning dip, and tried to encourage them not to catastrophize. So, so this is the FAIR plan. I'm just going to move into that. So it was the functions, accommodations, interventions, and response. And I'm going to start with the function. And this was developed by Mark Durand. He talked about, just the way when you have a baby that's crying, there's three different, there may be three reasons: they're hungry, they're got a wet diaper, or they haven't slept. This is the idea that there are, and I'm going to modify one of them, but sensory is it looks good, tastes good, feels good. Tangible is, if any of you have 3-year-olds, they want it now and they can't wait. And then there's the escape and attention. And I loved when I was presenting this, one person said to me, well, it's really not attention seeking, is often connection seeking. And I think that's a really nice reframe, because sometimes a teacher will say, well, he just wants attention. But what if we reframed it as that they're connection seeking? And this is just a reminder that negative attention is fast, efficient, and predictable. And it's way more. So trying to ramp up positive attention is really important. And it can be really difficult with an oppositional kid. And um, uh, I wanted, I wanted then just to have us talk a little bit about antecedents and looking at antecedents, behavior, and consequences. And um, sometimes one of the other things I think that can get overlooked is the setting event. And I was talking about antecedents, behavior, and consequences, and someone talked about having a nonverbal student, which many of us who have preschoolers, those are almost nonverbal kids, and how this one student was just losing it all the time, and they kept looking at antecedent behavior and consequences. And what came out was that this student was constipated. And so I think just also remembering that there could be setting events that we don't see. And uh, so again, sometimes people will say, if you're looking for the function of the behavior, are you trying to excuse it or rationalize it? And I think what we really want to say is we're trying to figure out, are there times when we unintentionally reinforce the behavior? So, for example, if our kid throws the chair, he might be doing it every time the work gets difficult. And it might be that it's a skill gap. So we want to be able to figure out, well, is he throwing the chair when there's a math quiz? And really the intervention ends up being fortifying his skill gap. This is just a cheat sheet, again, about what are typical antecedent patterns. And you may look at this and say, well, but Dr. Rappaport, you're like talking about everything in school. But unstructured times, transitions, writing demands, social demands, and novel events, unexpected changes, particularly with kids on the spectrum, that can really set them off. So in terms of accommodations, it's just, I'm going to go through some things where we we can think about how we can support kids. And one of the places that uh, are really challenging can be transitions. And we can think of transitions, macro transitions, like the difference between going to middle school and high school. But one that really trips up and can surprise uh, teachers and parents is that when good things happen, sometimes that's when kids will act up. And um, if you've had trauma, sometimes what happens is you're going to act up because if you've been doing well and you're about to have a birthday party or something, you may anticipate something bad's going to happen and you want to have agency and make it happen. So, uh, um, and I've loved some of the ideas that people have shared with me about helping kids with transitions. So, um, uh, a, a, a teacher told me about a kindergarten who struggled outside every time the bell would ring. It was overstimulating. And she made her a box with coloring little animals, and she would sit in the lobby and um, play happily by herself and sort of was able to um, tolerate the bell ringing. So it's just a reminder to us about how transitions can be challenging. And I feel like, particularly with my history of doing safety assessments, one of the other places we sometimes lose track of is when a child has been suspended for some aggressive behavior, when they come back into school, really being attentive to how they get integrated into the classroom. Another time that we want to be thinking about it is when a child might have been psychiatrically hospitalized and how they get reintegrated and what kinds of things they might, um, uh, how you pave the way to smoothly have them reintegrated. And um, and I really wish, and this comes from 25 years of practicing child psychiatry, that we had, and I would ask you to do this with your students, that you have them create a learning passport. How do they learn best? What helps them? And uh, there was a student with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, who exhibited behaviors that peers found quote unquote strange. And the teacher allowed him an opportunity to share about his diagnosis and why he sometimes did certain things. And it was a huge breakthrough for him. And so I think the other thing I would say in terms of transitions, and again, I'm sort of wearing two hats about both, is I would say for all of you, please review weapon policy and the internet policy with your students, because I have seen with when I'm doing safety assessment, kids who may in an impulsive way have um, said something and then somebody takes a picture of it, like I'm going to shoot up the school, takes a picture of it, and then doesn't realize that uh, when the police show up at the house, that this kind of threat is taken very seriously, even a verbal threat. So, um, and I guess I put it in around transitions because we're living in a world right now that is very different from where we lived, and kids can't be impulsive. They can't say things. They could torpedo their education with that. This is just a quick thing about micro transitions. So, going from art, which might be a preferred activity, to a non-preferred activity, and talking about sort of their three components: stopping the activity, shifting to the next activity, and starting the new activity. And sometimes providing for going from the preferred activity to the non-preferred activity, substituting something in that, like especially around recess, if some of you all I heard were K through 5, having kids come in from recess, then maybe doing art, then going to math, that can really help with avoiding meltdowns. Um, Previewing tasks, I think I love Sarah Ward has future glasses. I once wore them for a whole presentation where there were these huge glasses, that there's ways of signaling um, when you're going to be moving from one activity to another. And the time underlies every aspect of executive functioning. So 3 to 5 year olds, 20 minutes. First grade, several hours. third grade, 8 to 12 hours into the future. So the development of time horizon, it's not until college that people can think of 2 to 3 weeks. So um, I love another thing in terms of previewing tasks. This may be how this little preschooler thinks that we think that they ought to be ready for school, and this may be what they think is ready for school. So helping, often, taking pictures of what's expected of them and laminating it is something that can be really useful. So how that applies also with homework for those of you who are in high school is really encouraging teachers to show the finished product and helping and then working backwards. With self-regulation, what I'm going to share, even though I was talking about co-regulation before, I had a safe emotional thermometers. You know how we have emotional thermometers and we often talk about them with kids, but with kids who've had neglect, like the way that I was talking about before, they often don't understand their internal experiences. So having it much more be uh, talking about what you notice and about in their physical body so that they can get cued in to it can be really helpful. And, I noticed that your hands are tight and your shoulders are high, and helping connect his body state with his emotional state. Um, and I'm sure you guys do that sometimes when you're in working with clients. You might say, well, where do you feel it in your body when they're talking about something? And this is just talking about that. And it's funny. This is the growth I've learned. If you see this, we are talking about use my calming box under anxious. I changed the wording of it to comfort box because have any of you been told to calm down and that's the fastest way to make us speed up? So this is a comfort box versus a calming box. But I think you can have a whole class make a comfort box. And for the little ones, I once had a preschool teacher who made a pickle jar for their kids, and that's what they would talk about when they were in a pickle. But a comfort box can have things like something tactile, a cootie catcher. I don't know what the technical word is for that. This was um, a worry doll that had a bed made for it. So, uh, and this was for older kids encouragement cards. And I think we should have that in our teachers' rooms. We should have encouragement calls. And some schools do something like a secret gator, which is teachers sign up and get matched and they leave small surprises for each other throughout the year. We need that right now. And these are really sweet things that these high school students said. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And so just building that into the school culture, I think, is a really lovely thing.
Nancy,
Just
I have a quick question about those encouragement cards.
Mm.
I love them. I just logistically, this would the students write those and
Yes,
then they take
yes,
them when they need one? How?
yes,
Oh,
exactly. That's it. You got
oh,
it.
cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. This came from a school I worked at that was a therapeutic school, and I loved it. And yeah.
Well,
Um, so distress tolerance skills, there is Meza Kappa who has a 52-week curriculum for distress tolerance skills for teachers to learn, which you can go online and you can see some of the school distress tolerance skills. I think that there are ways to build in small things that can be distress tolerance. So glitter cream, eyes, butterfly self hugs. Some schools I've seen have had school nurses that will have frozen oranges to be able to have the tactile touch of oranges. Um, I think TIPS, which is TIPS, is something that's really helpful to teach your students who are in high school. Uh, I'm not going to go into it now, just only because I have 20 minutes before, but look it up. And if you're not, it's a fast way of being able to switch the channel if you're feeling overwhelmed. And I really like this app for high school kids. It's How We Feel, and it's free. And what it does is it helps kids identify all the different kinds of emotions. So it's not just happy, sad. You can see there's different ones here. Uh, and then it has 2 to 3 minute quick activities you can do that are short videos with how to support when you're feeling the various emotions. It was done by Yale. I think it works. It's good. Um, it's basically trying to do just what we're talking about with younger kids, which is helping them to identify emotions and then figure out how do I quickly figure out ways to support myself during that time. In terms of writing strategies, um, that's a place where I feel my memoir actually, I think, was an adult detachment interview to figure out how to write a story about my mom had died when I was 4, and I recognize how important it is to help um, us teach kids to have a voice. I was working once with a student, and he talked about he had he and his um, sister had a psychotic mother, and they had been left in a playground and had walked on a highway back to their home, and that's how the mother had lost custody. And he said to me and a teacher that the reason he never wrote in high school was because he was too afraid of what he would say. So I'm just going to offer these strategies, and there are many more, of course, but um, sometimes when a student struggles to write, it's because my ideas are jumbled, I can't get started, it physically hurts, and um, or my thoughts race too fast, or even a rough draft has to be perfect. I'm afraid to share my writing. And I cannot tell you from working with high school kids for 20 years how many times I've helped them write their story. And whether it's, I mean, coming to write an application for college and they get stuck with how do they tell their story. So these interventions here are a little bit for younger kids. I like it, okay, I don't like it, so that they get out of um, uh, black or white thinking or all or nothing thinking and breaking it down into how they might get started. So uh, looking in a book, looking at a writing idea list, drawing is, I've had some kids who really the way that they start is by drawing whatever it is that they want to say. Um, and this is just a reminder when I was during the pandemic, but I think it's as appropriate now, is thinking about how do we want to tell the story of what we're living through? And that what happens with trauma is it gets fragmented. You lose the coherence and it gets chaotic. And beginning to tell a narrative is so important. Being able to tell a narrative is so important. And I'm sure that's what you're doing. If you aren't familiar with Judy Cohen's work, she talks about trauma as a building a narrative and also learning emotional regulation skills with K through 8 kids, and it's really good work that she does. 12 sessions that she talks about, which I never believe you can do anything in 12 sessions, but I think that her ideas are really good and it's quote unquote evidence based. So just throwing that out. Um, and this is just a reminder. This is from Chris Willard. He's a colleague of mine. We run the HMS School Mental Health Conference, which I'd love to see any of you at in the first week of February 2026. But I like this acronym in terms of, I'm sure for any of you, when you've gone to write a paper, sometimes you get, it's hard to settle in. And I like this acronym of taking a mindful seat and first cueing into sensations, thinking about the motions, what your actions are and what your thoughts are. And if you, Chris Willard has written a small guided imagery of that. That's good. And I like for little kids talking about hot chocolate and how you inhale through your nose, exhale out through your mouth, of just thinking of playful ways that we can bring in meditation exercises to help kids when they might go into fight or flight. Uh, and it was interesting yes, there's another one, but just yesterday I was working with a student and it was so interesting to me because she's a performer and she knew with performing that she had to do exercises to get herself in optimal arousal. It's not the language she used, but she didn't think about it. Had ADD and trauma, and she didn't think about that actually she could generalize those skills for when she had to do anything that required executive functioning, which always made her escalate. So that's probably why I'm sharing that with you today. Okay. So uh, this is now just going to go through interactions. We're going to and how that's part of the FAIR plan, and to look at relationship building and random acts of kindness. I love in Seattle that they have February 17th is their random acts of kindness day. I think it's a nice idea to have it in school. They had buying coffee for a person behind you, sharing your umbrella, or vitamin D supplements. I think they were trying to make a joke. You know, uh, so, but Robert Brooks, he's a psychologist, he's been around forever. He's the one who developed the idea of islands of competency, and he talked about a kindness club, which I think is a really nice idea, particularly in the K through. Well, I think it's probably a good idea for all of our country right now, but particularly K through 5 it's a really nice age to introduce that idea of having a kindness club where the older kids are figuring out ways to be kind to the younger kids. This is just a reminder that um, kids who are traumatized can be prickly and that they may push away when really what we need to be doing is drawing in. And there was a wonderful counselor who told me about she used to call her kids her baby porcupines. So uh, I like this individual development plan. I like the idea of calling it, this is again from Dan Hughes, but the idea of calling it a individual development plan instead of an individual ed plan. And um, I think some of the fun activities enjoyed in and out of school, the frequency of to think about cataloging that, and an affirmation plan. How do you give compliments? Sometimes kids who are traumatized, they don't want to, when you give them a compliment that's verbal, they maybe feel singled out. They may decide that what they want is a nonverbal sign. Building resilience one-on-one time, identifying stress triggers, how they present their stress, and how often they use safe spaces. And um, I like the idea also of tapping in and building in your culture that if you see as school adults that somebody is needing support, that just building the language of tapping in. How many of us as parents, if we are lucky enough to have two parents, know that there are times you just have to pass the baton, and building that into the school culture. Um, I just like these questions for us to think about when we're with our students. When do you speak versus when do you be quiet? When to challenge versus nurture? When do you teach new information and when do you allow kids to process? And when do you notice versus overlook? And I just think those are really, you know, thoughtful ideas to ask ourselves. And this is just a reminder, especially for you all who have the younger kids, is about the beauty of controlled choice. And, you know, it's not whether you sit in the chair, but it's whether you're in the blue chair or the red chair. Um, Bella Hook likes to say, being oppressed means the absence of choice. So we want to give controlled choice. And the other thing I would say is many times teachers and parents, when they make a demand, especially women, they ask it as a question and really doing it as a neutral tone, making it and then moving away and sort of giving a little bit of time. So the last part that I wanted to talk about is response. I don't have a lot on that, I have to say, except for that. Uh, I think responses to avoid are timeouts, asking kids to sit in the hallway, because if you end up having them sit in the hallway or go to the principal's office, and again, you all might know this, but the principal's office often has a lovely secretary where they get lots of attention. So it's a nice place to go. And sitting in the hallway allows someone to avoid the work they're doing. So 90% of work is antecedent management. And um, I like this comes from, it's adapted from Better Than Carrots or Sticks. It's by Smith, Fisher, and Bray. It's a really good book for elementary school age kids. And they go through the function of the behavior, attention, tangible, escape, avoidance, control. But then I like this question, what warrants immediate intervention? And if it's harmful, clearly. Distracting the others, maybe. Contagious, definitely. I talk about that with sexualized behavior. The 4 chapters I have in, or sections I have, the last part in the behavior code is around sexualized behavior and working with um, peers about, do they reinforce the behavior when a kid is making a sexualized comment is really important. And are they testing the system? And um, is the student in optimal arousal when you have this discussion? Is it an isolated incident? Um, and then thinking about ways to ways to intervene. Do you move closer? Do you redirect? Do you relocate? Do you choose to ignore? And what might you be doing to reinforce? This is just a reminder that many times in classrooms we may create self-monitoring sheets, and I actually think it's really important to evaluate the behavior together and to figure out what strategies to use together. This is just a reminder when we were talking about detentions and suspensions. I think the idea of restorative justice versus retributive justice. And uh, retributive justice, which is what is happening in a lot of schools, is what rule is broken, who broke it, what's the punishment for breaking that rule. And restorative justice is what harm was done, what action would repair that harm, and who's responsible for that repair. I really like this book, The Violence Project. I'm just going to share with you in terms of, so that, again, because my other hat is doing safety and threat assessments besides the behavior code, how to stop a mass shooting epidemic. I like what they shared. So this was an interdisciplinary look at violence from professors of criminology around mass shootings, not just school shootings. But they said, which is so interesting, what the research says is a lot of what we were just talking about, that de-escalation, the first thing you want to do is de-escalate yourself because there's emotional contagion. De-escalate the space, so removing the audience, like we talked about with that gentleman who was from had frisks in front of other staff, lowering the lighting, um, using nonverbal communication, remembering that 80% of our communication is nonverbal. Like, God bless you, Caitlin, I've been noticing you nod your head while I'm giving my presentation, and it fills my heart. So that leaning in and then actively listening. And that's incredible to think about. This is a really fascinating read. If you think about, this is what they're saying is the boilerplate for de-escalating and they have some incredible examples of they had one, just to digress for a moment, they had one counselor who had not to scare you guys, but had a student who had come in and was armed with a weapon, and they were able to de-escalate using these techniques and avoid a disaster that happened. So, um, and just going back to Erin, if when you were talking about co-regulation, it would have been saying, your head's been down on your desk for a few minutes. I got the feeling you might be upset about. So joining around helping the student recognize the internal experience. Would you be willing to talk with me for a few minutes? And then taking the PACE model and providing a controlled choice. So I can see this is hard for you. Um, you know, so the last thing I just want to say is I loved during during the pandemic, I did a lot of presentations on trying to survive the pandemic. And these are some of the affirmations that educators talked about. And I want to leave them with you in terms of, and ask you for if there's any affirmation you all find fueling, because it's so important to stay filled up during this time. But I like some of these. Every finish line is the beginning of a new race. This too shall pass. It's okay to ask for what you need. These are affirmations that educators shared. My anxiety is lying to me. I'm not so sure right now if that's true, but maybe. Inhale the future, exhale the past. Be kind. The universe is setting us up for something great. And one of the participants said that she said her daughters who were 5 and 3. So think of this for you all who are working with preschoolers and kindergarten through fifth, started doing daily affirmations. And they started to say to themselves, I am brave, I am smart, I am kind, I am strong. And uh, I want to just thank you all and open it up for questions and just give you a quick preview for the next time. A couple things. One is if there is a case you want me to think about or integrate into my presentations next time when we meet at the end of October, um, uh, you can shoot me an email, nancy@nancyrappaport.com, or if you don't remember that, you can just put my name in and I have a website. There it is. But what I'm planning on doing is a kindergartner who's dysregulated. I've had all over the country, I've had educators give me some suggestions, and we'll use the template of the FAIR plan to think about the function, accommodations, interventions, response, and then also look at a ninth grader, a fourth grader, and a ninth grader, if we can do that all in an hour and a half. But please just send me your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. It will, I hope you can see I'm really passionate about teaching and I'm so grateful to have this time with you. Thank you.